it's part of history and not everyone's very interested in history, so I think they overlook it. And I honestly think the majority of young people believe the Holocaust was further, like a longer time than it actually was. And so for them to see me talking to Marla, a real life survivor of the Holocaust, who's an older lady but fit and healthy, and this happened within her time, is going to really bring to light the fact that the Holocaust wasn't very long ago, and we still need to continue to change our ways in every aspect. So before we get onto your life story, for me, I really want to understand, and for other people to understand, why it's so important for you to tell your story and to talk about the Holocaust and what you and your family went through.
Well, why it's important is so that other people learn from the Holocaust. There's a lot to be learned from it.
Yeah.
But there's just so many aspects. The other thing that's important is that, for me, that the people, the victims, are not forgotten. And I don't mean people like me who survived. I mean the people who didn't, and whose families were completely wiped out.
Yeah.
Sometimes a whole village. So there's no one to remember them. And if we don't, it will be as if they have never existed.
Yeah, I think it's so important. How old were you when the war started, and where did it kind of start for you and what you were experiencing?
Well, it started with bombing, as wars do. And because Poland was completely unprepared for it, they invaded very quickly. And our town was quite near the German border. So we were invaded in our town within 5 days of the beginning of the war. Ours was the first town in Poland, in the whole of Poland, to have a ghetto.
Wow.
Once the war started. And our ghetto started on the 1st of November, 1939. So within 2 months of the beginning of the war, we had already been forced out of our homes into ghetto walls. So once we got into the ghetto walls, life changed completely.
The process of getting into the ghetto, was it soldiers rounding up everyone and identifying between Jews and non-Jews, or were you already identifiable?
We were identified before.
Okay.
They created like a small town. It was only very small part of the town, and the least attractive part.
Okay.
And there were 15,000 Jews in our town.
Yeah.
And so they were all pushed into the ghetto, and we had an administration, and the people, there was a police force, there was a president, and people, those that had work were the privileged ones. But there were constant deportations. We were very short of food.
From the ghetto, what then happened?
Well, the ghetto was eventually liquidated about 2.5 years into the war.
So were you in the ghetto for 2.5 years?
Yes.
Okay.
And then we were going to be deported.
And when they
who had work permits were okay, they were safe. Mostly men. Some women, but children had no chance. And all the others were going to be deported. All the people except for those who had work permits.
I see.
And that was a very small
What
proportion.
gave you a work permit being given by the Germans in order to say that you were fit to work?
But I didn't have a permit.
Yes, well you were...
I didn't. I was a child. I was about 11 then. And then they created the barracks near their work. They became labor camps.
Wow.
So there were 2 labor camps, and the rest of the people were all deported to their death. We knew that they were going to Treblinka or Sobibor. In fact, our people, our town, they all ended up in Treblinka, which was a death camp.
Yes.
You arrived there, and within a few hours you were gone.
And so you were in the ghetto with your parents?
Yes.
And then from...
And then there was
What happened?
There was a deportation.
Yeah.
But we knew that the deportation was definitely to their deaths. Out of the 28,000 people, there were now 2,200 people left. And they all had work permits.
Wow.
I think it was actually 2,400. No, I'm not quite sure.
And
But
the rest
very
of the
few.
people were sent to concentration camp?
Well, they were sent, not concentration, annihilation camp. They were all killed. All of them except those that had saved themselves outside and those that had work.
And so from...
So
You were with your family?
Then I was with my family. It was still very overcrowded because we only had 2 streets then for the 2,400 people. But after a little while, they started rounding up the illegals.
Okay. You being one of them?
Yeah. And I was with my mother and sister and a lot of other people in a room. But they stormed in and took everybody away, except me. Because I was in bed. It just was somewhere to be. There was so little room and the bed was empty. And my mother said, she's not well. And he said, that's all right, she can stay. And that was this terrible policeman.
So he's the one that saved your life?
Saved my life.
Wow.
And even to the extent that when he met my father in the small ghetto somewhere during this short period before it was liquidated,
Yes.
he said, I've left your daughter, and if anyone tries to take her, mention my name. He gave me that sort of protection.
So your mother was taken?
My mother was taken
to
the synagogue, which before the war was a beautiful building. Then they used it as stables. It became very dilapidated. Anyway, they were there for, I can't actually remember how long. It must have been 2 or 3 weeks.
And you were still in the room
I was
whilst they
still
were
there,
there?
and my father and brother came home from work. I told them what happened, and some exchanges were taking place, but it was very difficult to get anyone out. But you know, with bribery and all that, people did come out. And my father could have got my mother out, but they would not let any children out, and my mother wouldn't leave without her. So after a little while, they took them all out of they marched them at dawn to the local forest called Rakov. When they arrived, they found their communal grave ready waiting for them. And others followed, and that's how they killed over 500 people. Also during that time, my aunt, an aunt on the Helfgott side, my father's side, she was taken away screaming, who'll look after my child? I was the only Helfgott member of the family left by then. I was 12 and my cousin was 5 and I looked after her. So by now I had this little cousin that I was looking after. And we're transferred to that factory. But we were standing there to be deported. The transfer came later because while we were standing there and people were being harassed and kicked and shot but we were being deported, and I don't know what gave me the idea. I looked to the right, I could see a German officer standing there. He was in charge, obviously.
Yes.
But there were lots of German soldiers with their rifles, Jewish police.
Yes.
And it was all a bit chaotic and frantic because people were terrified. And I stepped out of line, went up to the German officer, and I said, I've been separated from my father and brother. They're in the ghetto. Can I go back to them? He looked absolutely flabbergasted. I won't bother to describe. But he called over a Jewish policeman and said, take her back into the ghetto. And on the way, I said, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. And I said, but I can't go back without her. And really, I was arguing and arguing. I didn't know what to do, but what I'd say to people at that point is that the Holocaust was full of such dilemmas.
Yes.
Where you had to part with someone. One was going to their deaths, the other one was going to survive.
Yeah.
But anyway, in the end, he got fed up with, I suppose, with me, sort of insisting, and he said, oh, well, quickly, take her and go into the ghetto. And that, I know where these children and those people ended up, because there's a memorial for them, and it's inscribed. So had he not let me go back, there's no way out.
Had you not gone and asked?
Had I not gone and asked, yeah. So after that, we were transferred to this. We went to the plywood factory.
Yeah.
I became a slave laborer at the age of 12. My cousin, who was 5, didn't work. Obviously, she was just a little thing. And my father and brother, and we were no longer a family. The men was the men, the women was the women at the other end of the camp. And were only there about between 2 and 3 months when they decided to deport us again. And we found ourselves in Bergen-Belsen when we were liberated by the British Army. Wow. And that was the 15th of April, 1945, and they were amazing. I was sent to Sweden 3 months after the war with other children. And when I was in Sweden, I found out that Ben survived. And after that, the arrangements were made for me to come to England to be reunited with Ben.
Wow. That is just...
So that's it in a nutshell.
It really is just, unfathomable. And throughout this whole process, I think I sit here listening, trying to understand and put it into perspective of what you've been through, but it's not even imaginable from someone who's been raised in England and had the freedom that I've had, yet we're sitting across the table, both Jewish, and you had to go through so much in order for me to live a normal life.
Well, that's really perceptive of you to put it this way, that it is so important to tell the story so that it's not forgotten. Because if we forget, it will be as if these people never existed, and they will have got away with it.
I think that is the most powerful thing, is in order, you telling your story, you're able to inspire and change so many people's lives to make it a real account of what happened, because and for me, it means that throughout life and talking to people about being Jewish, the Holocaust, all of that, I can safely say, I've sat across the table from you, and it wasn't read in a book, it wasn't told by somebody that had spoken to somebody, but it was told by you who lived and experienced and went through what you went through. You've done March of the Living for 10 years in a row. Do you do that in order to tell your story so that it is never forgotten? Why do you choose to get involved with it?
Yes. Well, I think March of the Living do such an amazing job, because some people come to the March of the Living and they just do the march, which in itself is interesting, and the whole trip, just getting to Poland and seeing it. But this March of the Living, the British one, is so educational. To tell you the truth, I've learned a lot from it because, I mean, the fact that I went through it doesn't mean to say I have experienced everything.
Of course.
No one could possibly experience everything.
Of course.
I had my experiences, but then I learned of things that I really didn't know about.
Yes.
It's such a huge subject, and that is in itself is very rewarding. So I do get something out of it as well.
Of course.
But the students, the people who actually go on the March of the Living, it must be such an eye-opener. It's quite amazing.
I have no doubt it being an eye-opener and hearing from you and experiencing. Thank you for sitting here with me and telling me your story, because it's, got to say, like one of the biggest honours of my life to be able to sit here and talk to you and listen to your story in person. And thank you so much. It's
Well, nice of you to say that.
it's the truth. Thank you. That's a hard question. What I've learned through this process, I think, is the resilience that she had during the Holocaust, but also the hope that she had, and we were talking through everything, and just about being Jewish is so embedded in my roots and our roots, and that if we don't listen to Holocaust survivors and learn from their story, then, you know, the Holocaust and the Nazis win. And I think that was a really interesting point and conclusion we got to within our conversation.